Well, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to Onward today, and specifically to welcome James Cartlidge, the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence. Oh, there you are. Applause before you started.
Onward and upward.
Indeed. And James is a really good friend to Onward and brings great experience to his role as Shadow Secretary of State, having served previously as Minister for Defence Procurement. We're looking forward today to an important speech on the defence estate. The conditions in which our troops and their families live sits at the heart of the wider question of how we recruit and retain our service personnel. The world has not been such a dangerous place for many decades, and we need our armed forces more than ever. The men and women on whom we rely to keep us safe and their loved ones deserved better quarters than they've too often had to put up with. That's why James was right to launch the process of buying back the defence estate when he was in government, a theme he may touch on today. What is clear is that the Conservatives must and always will stand up for our armed forces and the covenant that exists between them and the nation. James is the man to do just that. It's my very great pleasure to introduce him today to speak to us on this theme.
Thank you, Simon. Simon, you're almost as tall as the flagpole, I have to say. Well, look, thank you so much, Simon. It's brilliant for you to introduce me and to be here with Onward. I think it's very appropriate because, of course, Onward very passionate about the housing issue. We've already put out some very important work on that, and I look forward to working with you further in the future. I hope this won't be the last such occasion, but thanks to everyone for coming relatively early in the morning. But as you know from the news, we have the latest clashes between Israel and Iran, and they emphasise once again that we live in belligerent times and that as a nation we must rapidly rearm, strengthen our overall deterrence and address head-on the most serious military threats that we have faced for years. A big priority is to rapidly replace munitions we rightly supply to Ukraine. We must also embrace autonomous and uncrewed technology to drive genuine battlefield advantage. But in my view, for all that I believe drones do offer a revolutionary way to increase our mass and lethality, the capability that still matters the most to our armed forces is its people. And so it should be a profound concern to all of us that they are still leaving service to their country faster than new recruits are joining. Indeed, the overall armed forces are down over 1,000 personnel in the past year, continuing the trend of outflow exceeding inflow through much of our time in office and has been seen in the armed forces of many NATO allies. So it is perhaps no surprise that for all their talk in opposition about Napoleon, etc., Labour have only pledged to enlarge the number of personnel in our regular or reserve forces into the 2030s. The truth is, this is a fundamental problem with no silver bullet. But as Shadow Defence Secretary, I am clear that the Conservatives must always prioritise the men and women behind the uniform as much as any shiny platform. There's no point in the SDR promising up to 12 attack submarines if you don't have the crews to operate them or the engineers to maintain them. So, if retention is ultimately the problem we are focused on today, the starting point is to understand why people are leaving the forces in the first place. In the most recent Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey, published last month, the single most common reason for personnel considering quitting was impact of service life on family life. 64% cited this factor. Now, for a party that believes in the family, it must be a defence policy priority for it to be possible to both serve in the armed forces and raise a family. 30% cited accommodation provision as a factor. Now, I believe we can address the long-standing problem with forces accommodation and have a far better offer for family life as a consequence. But to do so, we must seize the opportunity that is now at hand that has not been present for almost 3 decades. So what is that opportunity? I was very proud to have done so much of the work that enabled the government to buy back the defence estate after it was sold off in 1996 to Annington Homes. But restoring ownership is only the first step to transforming service accommodation. The government are now consulting on a defence housing strategy with proposals for the next steps on the estate due later this summer. In other words, for military housing, the decision point on future policy is right now. So please consider this as the opposition's recommendation as to how to make the most of this opportunity. Today, I'm announcing that our policy would be the formation of an Armed Forces Housing Association. Many governments have promised Homes for Heroes This is how we actually deliver the promise in practice. Our new Forces Housing Association will be a wholly independent body focused entirely on transforming the defence estate to deliver high-quality accommodation for service families. Independence would guarantee a financial ring fence, restoring trust that service family accommodation would always be well maintained to a high standard. And as housing associations are uniquely able to offer their own home ownership product, part buy, part rent, or shared ownership, as it's known, we would also widen the opportunity to get on the property ladder right across the ranks of the armed forces. So before going into the policy detail, just a quick background recap on the Annington deal. And I'm very honoured to have Julian Brazier and Ian Duncan-Smith here today, who I believe were two of the rebels who opposed the sale of the defence estate back in 1996. So here we are, almost 30 years later. So when I became Minister for Defence Procurement in April 2023, responsible for the defence estate, we were still reeling from a really bad winter in 2022 in terms of boiler breakdowns and all manner of problems with service family accommodation. Yes, it is true that with the backing from Secretary of State Ben Wallace and then Grant Shapps, we were able to get £400 million of funding into service housing and deliver a successful winter plan in 2023-24 that saw significant improvements and a big drop in complaints. But the truth is, from the first visit I made to the defence estate, I was genuinely ashamed that we were asking those who serve our country to put up with a structurally poor standard of housing stock to that degree. My conclusion from my first weeks in the job was simple. No more sticking plaster solutions. We needed to rebuild the entire estate. So as someone with a housing background before becoming an MP, I looked at the defence estate and concluded it is ripe for regeneration. The problem with rebuilding any estate is what's technically called decanting. This is where you move the existing occupants temporarily whilst you rebuild. But in the military, moving between properties on the estate is commonplace. Moreover, the present estate has very low density. These two factors make it ideal for regeneration and rebuild. So from early in the job, I told my officials that my top strategic priority was to buy back the defence estate, and with strong support from Grant Shapps and the officials in MOD, DIO and HMT, we got the deal underway and under negotiation by the election. It may have legally completed under the current government, but having had so much involvement, I feel particularly strongly that we must seize this moment to actually deliver a step change in forces housing, in practice, not just in word. So how to do this as effectively as possible? The first benefit of our new approach is the ability to deliver in reality the change we all want to see. If the rebuild of the defence estate is to be as ambitious as it needs to be, the organisation responsible for delivery will have to be able to both manage its day-to-day needs and be able to look to the longer term and the rebuild plan. That is a big challenge, but it is bread and butter for our best housing associations. The second benefit is about being a mutual organisation, truly on the side of our service personnel and critically their families. Now, the inspiration for this policy, and on this particular point, came from reading a paper about armed forces retention called Stick or Twist, written in 2020 by a leading defence think tank. The paper proposed the establishment of a Forces Housing Association structured, and I quote, as a self-standing trust for the benefit of service personnel and their families. The leading defence think tank in question was, of course, my shadow defence ministerial colleague, Mark Francois. But he was 100% correct, because Mark was on the Defence Select Committee when time after time I would appear before it for another dressing down about the latest problems with the defence estate, and at the time, particularly the performance of certain contractors. For personnel, the sense was one of faceless corporations who may or may not have been trying their best, but seemed distant from them and the military ethos. So the board would include representation from service families and the chain of command, able to directly influence priorities and policies. The third advantage would be the independent nature of the organisation, focused solely on delivering the best quality affordable homes for service personnel to the highest standard. Most importantly, this independence would ensure a financial ring fence, whereby funding allocated for service family accommodation could not then be raided by HMT or other parts of MOD. Of course, they would never do that, would they? Likewise, where redevelopment of the estate led to surplus land sales, again, any proceeds would be retained 100% by the Housing Association for reinvestment back into the estate. Again, HMT probably wouldn't be too keen on that, it has to be said. In addition, Like any housing association, this is important, the organisation would have prudential borrowing powers solely for the purpose of delivering its remit in respect of the service family accommodation. Just to stress, this would not count as a public spending commitment because housing association borrowing is not classified in the public accounts. The fourth and final benefit of our approach is the reinvigoration of home ownership throughout the ranks of the armed forces. Just to be clear, we are not talking about personnel being able to buy out their own service family accommodation in a sort of military right to buy. Having just bought back the estate, we don't want it to immediately sell it off again, even if it's to the occupants. Not least because of the deferred decision, Andrew Murison is here in the audience somewhere, to extend the eligibility for service family accommodation to unmarried couples. Andrew served alongside me as a Minister for Personnel and Veterans and Families. And as he knows, there was this huge problem that having promised to extend eligibility to unmarried couples, basically you needed a lot more property. And that's why the only solution was to buy back the estate and do a full rebuild. So where are the home ownership opportunities? They're in two areas. First, the housing association could offer aspiring homeowners the chance to purchase a home on the open market, thus freeing up precious SFA properties in the process on the core defence estate. Secondly, the current low density of the estate would mean that it could be rebuilt to a level that delivers both the homes we need within the estate, which remain for cheap rent, and create surplus homes for sale on the open market. Now, like all housing associations, this one would have what are called nomination rights, and serving members of the armed forces who wish to get on the property ladder would have priority for these surplus homes. I think that's something the government will probably look at as well. So, there already exists an armed forces home ownership scheme, Forces Help to Buy. But according to the latest AFCAS survey, the one I mentioned earlier, and I quote, officers are considerably more likely to own their own home, with 72% home ownership, compared to other ranks at 39%. So to finish today, I wanted to talk through a case study of how we would increase home ownership in those other ranks. So before I came into Parliament, I ran a company involved in the shared ownership sector. And there are basically two ways of buying a property through an affordable housing scheme. This is not right to buy. Right to buy is very exceptional. You buy the council house you live in. This is not that. They are shared equity and shared ownership. Shared equity is where you legally buy an entire property in the normal way, but your deposit has been lent, it's effectively borrowed. So Forces Help to Buy is a shared equity scheme. The main Help to Buy product that we had through much of our time in government is a shared equity scheme. With shared ownership, it's very different. The freeholder, which is normally a housing association, owns the property, and you buy a share in the property and you pay rent on the remainder. That's why it's known as part buy, part rent. Very importantly for this offering, it can only be offered by housing associations. So the very nature of this policy opens up the opportunity to increase home ownership products. So if you want the technical reason, it's because if you buy the share and you go into arrears, you can't automatically be repossessed because a housing association owns the property. So what they do is they guarantee to cover any arrears. That's basically how mortgage lenders lend into shared ownership. That's been going on since the 1980s, so it's very established. So just to be clear, this is a part-buy-part rent scheme. So you'd still have Forces Help to Buy, but alongside it, you'd now have Forces shared ownership. And let me explain why it enables greater affordability. So we have a private soldier on £26,334, technically the lowest rank above a trainee, based in Aldershot Garrison. With Forces Help to Buy, he can be loaned a deposit capped at 50% of salary. So if he's on £26,000, that's £13,000. In Aldershot, the average house price over the past year on Rightmove, and there are other property websites, including my own, was £329,000. Not affordable with Forces Help to Buy. I mean, £13,000 would actually be less than 5%, even if they topped it up with their own savings. You're talking about more than 10 times their salary for the remainder. And I'm assuming in this case, and this is important because this is often the real case study, that they have a partner who's recently had a baby, so isn't working at the time, or is on very low income, and that's going to be a common case study. Remember what I said at the beginning. People are leaving the armed forces because of the pressure of family life. So they're at a junction in their life when they might think, maybe we should move. And then, we can get higher earnings and we'll have to leave the armed forces. We want to stop that. So how would we offer a new route to home ownership? So let's think about this. The housing association can access prudential borrowing, as I said. They could buy a property on the open market, and this private soldier can buy a share from as little as 25%. That's £80,000. So after deducting the £13,000 deposit, that leaves a mortgage of £67,000, which is under 3 times their salary. Now, obviously, they have to pay rent on the remainder and they have to be able to afford that, but we would have that rent at the same level as on SFA, very low rent. If they left the armed forces, it would go up to standard housing association level, so there's also an incentive to stay in the armed forces. But hopefully you can see how this could be transformative. And there's a really important reason. I said earlier, talking about Andrew Mirison, we desperately need much more accommodation in the core defence estate. SFA, this is the cheap rented accommodation where you can move between bases and so on. How do we get more quickly? If you rebuild it and regenerate it, fantastic. That's where most of the new property will come from, but that will take years. If the people running this housing association concluded we need 2,000 or 3,000 more homes, they can encourage those who are aspiring to buy a property and it frees up SFA. So I think this is a really important development. And to conclude, Kemi has been clear that to renew our party, we need to tell the truth to win back trust. The truth is there is no easy answer on retention in the armed forces. But we do know that the current defence estate is far below the standard our troops deserve. Transforming it is not just about improving the physical quality of the housing stock, it's ultimately about boosting the quality of life of those who serve and their families. Aspiration, social mobility, home ownership, these are conservative principles. They are at the core of a defence policy that supports family life alongside service to one's country, sending a clear message to the brilliant men and women of our armed forces: we've got your back. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. That's very kind. Now, we've got some questions, starting with Larissa Brown from The Times. Larissa.
Thank you. I was at a military base recently in Lincolnshire, and I was looking around the housing. I was quite struck by the fact that you can't make home improvements to the property, like building flower beds or patio in the back garden, without then having to restore the house back to the original quality after 2 years. So people were saying how crazy that was, and it would make it look way, way nicer, and then they'd have to paint the walls white again and get rid of the flowers, literally take the flowers up. So is that something that you would look at reviewing, given how crazy that is?
What?
And just a second question was just on 3% as well, and the NATO target. Do you think that Labour should be committing to hit that 5% target on defence-related expenditure by 2032?
Two very good questions. I mean, on the first point, absolutely. When I was Defence Procurement Minister, the most common emails you would get were not about the nuclear deterrent or other things you were responsible for. They were overwhelmingly about 38 Sycamore Drive in Aldershot and the tree that hasn't yet been cut down, etc. And you know what? Those things really matter to service families. The sort of thing you're talking about is a big deal. And what I would say is this: if it's a housing association running the estate that has members of the military on its board and service family representation, they would communicate these things in there. It'd be much more direct, and hopefully these things would be dealt with in that sense. But I also think if you rebuild the estate, and this is perhaps the most important point, the quality of the homes is fundamentally low. I mean, in many ways, they're structurally unsound. You can throw all the money at them that you want. If you rebuild today, by definition, they have to be built to the higher standard, and housing associations would have the higher social housing standard, and hopefully we would address these issues. On the spending point, I mean, look, talking about 3.5%, 5%, this government are not going to spend 2.5%, just to be absolutely clear. This is now crystal clear. Smoke and mirrors are being deployed in a way that is, I find, absolutely extraordinary. It's already commonplace. Journalists and commentators talk about 2.6%. They're not going to spend 2.6%. We think with intelligence spending that's been added to the MOD, which is not part of the defence budget, it's not how we defend ourselves in the military sense, it's something like 2.43%. But the problem, and this is where, may I say, we need your help, we are finding it so hard to get anything out of the government in written questions. This has been commented on by, I think, other lobby journalists, the way we're just not getting any information. I mean, you know, I can tell you, with me and Mark in the team, we'll post so many pursuant written questions until, you know, they are blue, but it is extraordinary. And so we've now got rumours they'll go to 3.5% based on adding in the cost of Heathrow and food security and so on. I mean, the public are not stupid. If they do that, that will be a breach of faith with the British public. When they pay their taxes, they expect that to go on defence and to mean actual defence, improving the capability of the armed forces. Jerome. right next door.
Thank you. I'm curious, so how will a housing association, from a soldier's point of view, or a sailor or airman's point of view, aviator's point of view, be different to Pinnacle or any of the other companies, those distant companies which aren't connected to them? Ultimately, it feels like this could be the MOD, if it's implemented, outsourcing responsibility to a housing association, which fundamentally is short of cash, is under-resourced, is overstretched, and therefore is no different to the private contractors who were doing it before.
No, look, I think that's a very, very good question. Housing associations do use contractors, so how would they be different? I mean, the first point to say is just to understand the most important reason for this policy. I mean, I think the home ownership stuff's important. I think there's many aspects to it. The most important one is, we all know, anyone in this room who's been in government, the hardest thing is actual delivery. So you've bought back the defence estate, fantastic. You now want to deliver a regeneration of the estate, rebuilding those properties to higher standard, having greater density so you can have more homes. Planning that is a big deal. But the best housing associations, there are examples all around the country, big regeneration schemes, Woodbury Down in Hackney and so on, where they haven't just rebuilt housing, they've built communities and a sense of place. And something Mark suggested to me when we first came up with this, if you give them real financial independence, and I think this is critical to it, if, for example, they've got a receipt from a sale of land over in this part of the estate, they might decide the best thing to do with that money is to spend it on childcare facilities, because that's what the service families are saying. This is actually the thing we need. I think that's the crucial thing. It's that greater level of freedom and autonomy. And, you know, if I'm honest, why will this be difficult for the government? Because I think some will be considering something like what I'm saying. The reason it'll be difficult is because of three letters, HMT. They will worry about losing control. They want to be able to control the budget. They'll want to be able to raid it if they want, if there's an underspend. In our case, if there's an underspend, it sits with the housing association and it can work out where to invest it to improve the quality of life of personnel. So I do think it's an opportunity to make a big difference. But you're right. You can see how if the government took this policy, it could be delivered in a way that was, dare I say it, smoke and mirrors. Catherine Forster. Oh, yes. Hello, Catherine. Yeah.
Over 14 years, why would they believe that it would be different under you going forward? And also on Iran and Israel, obviously the UK supported Israel before the Houthis. Would you be willing, potentially, for us to do so again, given the very direct threats that have been made against us?
I'm very sorry, did you say Walsall or Warsaw? As in Poland, yes. Okay, so, I mean, on that, you know, over those 14 years, I think we always spent pretty much the minimum NATO spend. We've never been under it. Some countries have been way under. But we have to be honest and say, when you're on 2%, if you want to maintain a nuclear deterrent and the Army, Navy and Air Force to the standard we expect, you will end up cutting corners in some areas. And in particular, and Ben Wallace was open about it, so he called it hollowing out, though he meant under successive governments. Infrastructure is a classic example of a place where you cut those corners. The Treasury, they love this. I was a Treasury Minister, I'm not anti the Treasury, but it's just the reality of government. They like moving stuff to the right, as they call it. Not politically, they like moving stuff into the future so that you don't have to pay for it anymore. But you lose money, actually, because it becomes more expensive. I'm afraid the worst example of all that is not in defence accommodation, as important as that is. It's in the nuclear deterrent, where the decision, Lib Dems' influence to delay the new boats coming in means that the current boats are beyond their natural service life and it's costing more to maintain them, and those great sailors are out there far too long, and it's shameful how long they're out there. But look, I go by my record, and I had the backing of Grant Shapps. We bought back the defence estate. We've got an amazing opportunity to make up for that record. My final point is, I actually think it doesn't matter what money you would have thrown at them. The physical houses that were built were not built to last. They weren't even built for showers, and that's why we've had damp and mould. So you've got to rebuild. That's why the ownership point is so important. On Iran and Israel, obviously we don't know what the United States is going to do. That's subject to speculation. I think John Healey was right yesterday at the Defence Conference in London, where he said, Secretary of State for Defence, obviously, where he said, we've got RAF Typhoons in the region. They are there if we need them to support allies or for other needs. I think that's the right approach. But from my point of view, because I do think the Prime Minister, we haven't heard a lot from him very much on this. We're very clear. Iran is a threat. We don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. The report last week from the atomic energy inspectors was that the level of uranium enrichment, and I think the phrase was, is unprecedented for a non-nuclear armed state. That is really serious. You know, they attacked, the Houthis were backed by the Iranians, they gave them ballistic missiles to attack our own ships. Imagine what would have happened if they'd been successful. It would have been devastating. So this is a serious threat, and we're very open in our party about the nature of that, and so we do understand why the Israelis have taken the action that they have done. Is there anyone from I have the BBC down here. Ah, yes, sir. My apologies, I didn't have your name.
Sam.
Okay.
I just wanted to know, you're saying this is going to be powers to borrow to fund this.
Yes.
Do you see it being completely self-funding? Do you think it's going to need support from the government to be able to invest in these houses?
So the policy is not a spending commitment. The presumption is there may be some very minor ancillary costs when you set up the housing association, but don't forget there should be saving in terms of Defence Infrastructure Organisation who run the estate at the moment. It's just, I think, you know, and yes, you would have to, for example, recruit a really good leadership figure from the housing association sector, in my view. But in terms of the impact, the borrowing is not scored on the public sector. That's standard for all housing associations, and under the Armed Forces Covenant, you can't treat defence any differently, so we wouldn't, and they would have the same powers. Of course, they'd have to be spent prudentially, and for the purposes of whatever their constitution would be. And the constitution would be very simple. It's there to deliver high-quality, affordable homes for members of the armed forces, and policies that enable that. So policies that increase the scale, for example, regeneration, they would fund. And as for the funding of the estate itself, it would simply be, but it's quite important, the same funding level that is spent on SFA by DIO, the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, would be given to the Housing Association. The difference is once they've got it, they are independent. So the figures from the Treasury and elsewhere, and dare I say the chiefs as well, who think, you know, we're getting to the end of the year, we might want to move the stuff we were going to spend on repairing the windows on the estate in wherever, we want to spend that on some other thing, right? They couldn't do it. And that's so important because this is about trust, isn't it, really, right? Members of the armed forces don't trust that people will prioritise those mundane daily things against all the other glitzy priorities we think they've got. And this guarantees that by putting the ring fence in place. So I think that's why it's critical. Finally, Ellie Wheatley. Ellie.
Yes, hello.
Oh, there you are. Hello.
Hi.
From Guido, yes.
Do you have a specific target for regular service army personnel numbers? And if so, what is it?
No, I don't have a target. I think the crucial point is you've got to stop the level of the number of people leaving. So at the moment, you can set all the targets you want. And let's be honest, the reason John Healey has said a bigger army, regular army, next parliament, bigger reserves in the 2030s, which is a long way off, the Russians will have presumably noted that. The reason they're saying that is because I think they've realised these issues are, and I'm open about it, they're fundamental. So, you know, you've got to be pretty brave to think you can suddenly stop this. At the moment, the outflow is higher than the inflow. It's 1,000 down since the election alone. And most of that's the army. This is a serious problem. And there are other issues here. If you look at, so number one issue for leaving is the impact on family life. I think number 2 or 3 is the impact on your spouse not being able to fulfil their career because you're in the middle of some estate in Albemarle in Northumberland. Beautiful estate that it is, which I had the pleasure to visit with Guy when he was the MP. But I think that, you know, if you put yourself in the shoes of this private in Aldershot or someone else on the lower ranks on a base whose partner's had a baby, they're thinking of their options, we are giving them a new option that is real and serious. And they can therefore perhaps, they wouldn't be living on the estate anymore, they might be going further into town so that, you know, once the baby gets older, the mother could potentially go back into work. And that is a massive factor. You know, we don't talk about these things. When do you hear defence debates where people talk about consideration of what the spouse is going to do? But this is what matters in the sort of nitty-gritty day-to-day of the reality of people making life choices, which at the moment mean too many are leaving the armed forces, and we need to reverse that. Any other questions? Julian.
James, could I just congratulate you on the work you did to buy back the estate on a brilliant scheme today, without today, and something you've never taken any credit for at all, which is heading off that really catastrophic shot in the foot really just 2 points, if I may. The first is that the fiddliest bit will be those opportunities to buy on the surplus properties. Could I suggest you need a wraparound piece of legislation there on letting them, because some of our most valuable people are on the move all the time,
That's a good point.
including, for example, all our RAF pilots. And unless you have a separate tenancy agreement so they can very quickly get the house back when they need it, you will quickly find people leaving at the point where they bought it because they suddenly find that they're
Yeah, yeah.
about what's going to happen to it next. Second point, the arrangement you just announced is exactly what existed for more than half a century for the Reserve Forces Estate, administered by the RFCAs.
Interesting.
About 20 years ago, the Treasury started undermining it. They now have less control, speaking to somebody who sits on the board of an RFCA, less control than the single services have over their estates. It's all gone. Can we have the RFCA's powers back again so that they can control them, sell a bit off here and use the money to improve it? Because there are broken boilers all over it, there are roofs leaking, we've got people in reserves who can't drain because of it.
Very good questions, and I may say, you wrote a very good paper, Mark, but also you did a very good paper on the reserves, which is recommended reading, and I'm hopefully you'll be speaking to Ben Abessi-Jekti here at the front, my PPS, who will be running our policy on the 3 Rs, recruitment, retention, and reserves. On the first question, I think that's a really good question. So the Housing Association, I think, would have to have the powers to determine the standard lease. And that lease will include the rules on letting out your property. And I think, again, remember, this organisation is run by the military. And I think they would say, in our case, we want to have greater flexibility on being able to rent it out within reasonable restrictions. You can't, rent it as soon as you buy it, sort of thing. It must be reasonable. But you're right. We have to remember this is for people serving in the armed forces. We don't want them to leave. So therefore, they're going to have the lifestyle of someone in the armed forces, which is constant deployment. And we've got to reflect that. When I went to Ukraine, I was very lucky because we did it for John Healy. I had soldiers with me, CP, I think they call it, close protection. And we had these very long drives to get to where we were going. And in that time, fascinating, talking to those soldiers about what they thought of forces help to buy. And a particular thing that mattered to them was the flexibility over being able to rent out if they were deployed elsewhere. So I think that would be a priority. On the second point, that's really important about the reserves estate. Ben, you're going to have to look at that, okay? I'm passing the buck, shamefully, there to my PPS. But yes, sir, at the front.
James,
Yes, Simon.
For Onward in housing. It's amazing how often the answer to these big problems comes back to housing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, on a day where the government has announced a national housing bank, which is effectively a consolidation of existing activities from Homes England, which I used to chair, there is an almost limitless amount of guaranteed capacity that can be used for affordable housing there to quickly ramp up
Yeah.
the state. Clearly not consolidating contingent liability from a Homes England or government perspective. So there is the potential with that to scale up your
Yes.
investment idea very quickly. I think that's what I'm saying.
Well, Simon, and I didn't know you chaired Homes England. Thank you for letting me. I mean, and by the way, because remember, under the Armed Forces Covenant, the military cannot be treated less favourably than other parts of society. So if housing associations can apply to Homes England, these guys could. Just because they have a funding stream in the MOD, they would still be able to apply for that funding. And I think you're right about ramp up. Julian raised the point about these additional homes. Clearly, where the main home ownership opportunity will come from is when you rebuild to greater density. And just not to scare people, greater density, we are not talking about massive tower blocks. At the moment, it's incredibly inefficient, the layout. You could still have houses for SFA in most parts. London would be a challenge, but you could still have houses with gardens if you design it effectively. And that's why I think the key to this policy, I cannot emphasise enough, is having that combination of managing it day to day and having the big wider view of how you properly regenerate. I think it could be one of the most exciting regeneration programs for years. It's about the level, as always, the level of ambition and buy-in from the government, and hopefully we'll have plenty of that. As it's 10:30, I'm going to take two together as the final question, because two very important ladies sitting there with their arms up. Baroness Goldie and AMT. Baroness Goldie.
James, further to the question from Julian, given the renters' rights bill currently going through Parliament to preserve the
Yes.
right of service personnel to recover possession on expiry of their period of
Yeah.
leave, is that going to be possible? Because, as you're aware, the strength
I think there should be. I mean, the principle has to be. So remember, we're talking about this is the service family accommodation within the estate, the low-cost rental homes that must remain that way because of the amount of churn within the estate. If someone owns it, that's not going to work. So that's got to remain like that. The deal is you pay very low rent, but in exchange for that, there are rules about once you leave the armed forces, your entitlement changes. I think you get a certain number of months. And that has to be the case because new people are coming in. You know, so I think you would have to have some kind of exception. I don't know the exact legal detail of the question, but I repeat the point to Julian in terms of the housing association because you're talking about these bodies deal with all these things all the time. It's standard meat and drink to them. So I think that this would be something to look at reasonably, but the deal must be if you leave, any favourable conditions, low cost, etc., that has to end at that point after a transition period. Anne-Marie, last question.
Just to follow on, this was something that we tried to make progress on as part of the work we did with the Armed Forces Covenant. The reality is that nobody is a tenant in SFA, they're licensees.
Yes.
This is the great weakness in empowering those, whether in SFA, it will be different from housing association model, which I think is excellent, by the way. We need, and it has to be done legally, to find a different way of allowing them to be tenants, albeit, as you just said, if they move house or base, SFA-wise, they don't maintain tenants' rights. But they have no tenants' responsibilities either, which, to Larissa's point, is what drives them all nuts. So there's a really important piece, and I failed, so I'm happy to put my hand up, failed to get the MOD lawyers to tackle this, but it should be done in an Armed Forces Bill, which is a tenancy status for existing SFA licensees, because they have no authority or voice at all at the moment.
So I don't know the legal position on that. I'm going to once again be a total coward and say, if the two of you wanted to do a paper for me, genuinely, and submit it to our policy board, that would be absolutely fantastic. Because I just don't know the legal detail, and I wouldn't want. But I think they should remain as licensees on the main estate, because the principle has to be you're there to serve in the military, and they have a particular, the issue of deployment creates all those. The flux and the moving around, etc. But I think that resolves everything. It's 10:30. Thank everyone for your time. Thank you.